So here we are again, George R.R. Martin, Tolkien, two massive acclaimed authors in their own right. Two great figures of fantasy, but two very different ends of the fantasy spectrum. Did you think I was done talking about huge literary figures? Think again! Hi everyone and welcome back to Girly Geek Talk. First of all, before I begin and jump into this next video, I just want to say a massive welcome to everyone who has joined the channel as a subscriber and came from my previous video. It is such an honor to hit so many views in a video and to be able to have so many of you subscribe and be part of the gang. It is very exciting. I don't even know what I should call all of you. The gang? The girly gang? Get it? Because this is Girly Geek Talk? I have a feeling most of you wouldn't want to be called girlies. Never mind. In any case, we're so close to hitting 500 subscribers, so please subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoy the video. After my recent video on why Tolkien disliked Dune, I found myself thinking about another fascinating literary disagreement. This one is a little different. George R.R. Martin loves Tolkien. As he has said himself time and time again, without Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, there would be no Game of Thrones. So why are we discussing both of them today? Well, because George R.R. Martin and Tolkien represent two very different ends of the fantasy spectrum. Despite admiring Tolkien, Martin has spent decades arguing with one of Tolkien's biggest ideas. This is not me saying that he hates Tolkien. On the contrary, Homeboy over there apparently reads The Lord of the Rings more often than yours truly. But to anyone who has read any of George's literary works, you're probably figuring out where I'm headed with this. George R.R. Martin probably thought Tolkien left out some very important questions, and that disagreement may be one of the biggest arguments in all of fantasy literature. So today, let's talk about Tolkien versus George R.R. Martin, and why fantasy fans are still choosing sides, even though honestly, we can all agree that both series are amazing in their own right. So let's clarify something important first. Martin has never hidden his admiration for Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings completely changed fantasy when it was first published in the 50s. Of course, before Tolkien, fantasy still existed, but we can all agree that after Tolkien, fantasy exploded. Almost every modern fantasy author is responding to Tolkien in some sort of way. Even Dungeons and Dragons was heavily inspired by Tolkien's works. So after that, it's only natural that you get some authors that imitate him, some who choose to rebel against him, and some who do both. In my opinion, Martin belongs firmly in that last category. Though he loves Tolkien, he also asks difficult questions about Tolkien's world, and perhaps his most famous question concerns Aragorn. If you spent any time in fantasy circles, you've probably heard this quote. Martin once asked, "What was Aragorn's tax policy?" I'm sure that, like me, you're probably thinking, why are we talking about taxes when we got Aragorn as king and Arwen as queen and bad guy defeated and the end, thank you very much? But Martin was making a serious point. Tolkien tells us Aragorn is a great king. He's noble to a fault and wise beyond his Dunedain years. He's courageous, the son of Arathorn and the rightful heir. But Martin wondered, what happens to rulers and the small folk after the coronation? How do you feed people? How do you govern? What do you do when there's famine? What happens when noble ideals collide with messy reality? Martin wasn't saying Tolkien was wrong. He was asking a pragmatic and realistic question. On one side, you have Tolkien, who was interested in how a king should be, whereas Martin was interested in how a kingdom actually works. This brings us to perhaps the biggest difference between the two authors. Tolkien believed evil was real. The world was very much black and white. His bad guys don't just display bad behavior and corruption. They're representations of pure evil. Sauron and Morgoth are evil figures inspired by what Tolkien saw during his lifetime. The instrument of their evil deeds, the One Ring, corrupts those who come near it. And in Tolkien's world, there are moral truths, but Martin takes a different approach. His world is inspired by the War of the Roses, a very real medieval succession rule which took place between 1455 and 1487. George R.R. Martin's world is differing shades of morally grey. His characters are rarely purely good or purely evil. Sure, Jaime Lannister is labelled a king-slaying ruffian, but later we learn if he had not done that, all of King's Landing would be engulfed in the wildfire plan of the Mad King. The Hound is brutal in his rough way of dealing with characters, but he is also deeply human and tries to change, especially near the end of his life. If you're interested in him, click the link shown in the screen now to watch a video made in relation to his story. Tyrion can be compassionate one moment and cruel the next, especially in the books. Martin's world is filled with grey morality because Martin believes people are complicated. But I believe, as always, that both authors have a point. We love Tolkien's because he reminds us what courage looks like, what a true fairy tale for grown-ups can be. We also love Martin because he reminds us how flawed human beings really are, the reality we face every day. When you stare at your fellow man across the table at a restaurant, you don't see a purely good or bad person. Hopefully, maybe you see the differing moral layers that make us all human. Many people describe Tolkien as optimistic and Martin as cynical, but I don't think that's entirely fair. Remember, Tolkien fought in the First World War. He saw horrors most of us can barely imagine, yet he still believed in friendship, because every soldier to him was Sam, Frodo, Merry, or Pippin. They were boys who showed loyalty and cowardice and mercy and hope. They were everyday people trying to do the right thing. Martin, meanwhile, isn't simply cynical. His books are full of sacrifice. For example, in the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms series, we see Dunk, a lowly hedge knight, also try to protect the weak and innocent. John shows bravery time and time again. Eddard, with his last moments, still searches for Arya in the crowd, his love for his children unmatched. And Davos's acts of kindness towards Shireen are just beautiful. And of course, there's many other examples. This is beyond a mere comparison between optimism versus pessimism. It has to do with perspective. On one hand, Tolkien asks, what should humanity aspire to become? On the other hand, Martin asks, what are humans actually like? Those are very different questions, and they produce equally very different stories. Perhaps the clearest distinction is when one realizes this. Tolkien writes mythology, whereas Martin writes history. The Lord of the Rings feels like an ancient legend. In fact, it was written to be perceived as such. A forgotten tale discovered by modern humans, a story passed down through generations, and a mythic struggle between darkness and light. Whereas the Song of Ice and Fire series feels quite different. It feels historical because, as I have mentioned before, it was based on British royal history and civil war. It is political and messy, and like medieval chronicle, filled with betrayals and competing ambitions. Tolkien looked to Beowulf and Norse mythology, whereas Martin looked to the Wars of the Roses. Neither approach is better. They were simply trying to achieve different things. So, I hear you type in the comments below. Who wins? Who has the better story? Did Tolkien's vision of fantasy triumph, or did Martin's? Well, everyone, I'm afraid I'm going to have to say the answer is neither. Modern fantasy contains both. You can see Tolkien's influence everywhere, and you can also see Martin's influence in similar spaces. How many of you noticed a rise in fantasy films after the Lord of the Rings series that came out in the early 2000s? How many of you noticed important characters dying in many shows and films after Game of Thrones became popular because of the shock value from Eddard's passing, which was such a novelty that we had not been accustomed to? Many authors are also trying to combine the two differing moral perspectives, the idealism of Tolkien and the realism of Martin. The result is a fantasy genre that is idealistic and pragmatic, richer than ever. Perhaps the biggest argument in fantasy isn't really Tolkien versus Martin, but the simple question of whether fantasy should show us the world as it is, or as we ideally like it to be. Tolkien and Martin gave very different answers. Which one do you agree with the most? Are you Team Tolkien or Team Martin? Or maybe perhaps somewhere in between? Please let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.